as promised, we're going to go through how do you actually shift things left with accessibility. And the way we're going to do this is narrowing in on prototype reviews specifically. And want to leave you with more of a practical guide of how to tackle this so that you're incorporating users' voices not just early, but also often is the other key piece to this. And so to do this, I'll give us a quick rundown for what we'll be doing today, which is discuss the value around prototype reviews and just level set so that we can go more in depth in terms of how do you augment your approach based on who you're working with and kind of those considerations depending on the assistive technology that is in the room. And the last, we're going to go even further with one specific group, screen reader users. I want to just leave folks with a practical guide around how do I tackle this research method and feel confident actually approaching that and getting useful insights from my study. And so seems a little bit silly for this group because I'm sure I have experts and prototypes in the room, but I do want to just quickly level set so that we're all talking about the same thing for today when I say prototypes. So I have 3 buckets on the screen for low fidelity, high fidelity, and functional. We're mainly going to be in the high fidelity bucket for today with what we discuss, but I'm happy to kind of pepper in things for low fidelity, functional, depending on what folks want to ask in the Q&A. Happy to add that in. But so for our different prototypes, with all 3 of them, there's a lot of value that you can get. And mainly that's because you're meeting with folks early in the cycle rather than waiting down the line. And so the really tangible value that you get from this is catching those accessibility challenges in the research and design phases. So before anything's built, you're able to catch like, oh, you know what? We aligned a bunch of elements and no one who uses magnification can find that. Let's switch up our designs to better address that. And so you're able to get these really actionable insights in terms of how you've laid out the page, your information structure, your labeling, font, color, all that jazz. You're able to kind of get direction from users to know what's not just compliant, but what's a good, enjoyable experience for folks. The other cool side about prototype reviews is you're able to get engineering advice and pass that on to your engineering teams in the sense of how folks want something to behave programmatically, how they expect it to be labeled, how they expect it to work with their assistive technology. This is all feedback that's really important to capture and can be really helpful for an engineering team, no matter where they are in their own accessibility journey. Just having some insight into user expectations around the behavior of your common components that you're leveraging. It's all really useful. You just have to make sure that you're sharing it with the right team. Lastly, which is a really arguably the most important, is you're moving people's voices further up in your product. And so if you're taking an approach where you're just doing evaluative research at the end, you're basically going to your assistive technology users and saying, hey, how'd I do? Instead of it being more of a collaborative approach where you're doing participatory or inclusive design with folks throughout, and it's more of a, this is what I'm thinking, what are your thoughts? And iterating on that process at the start and throughout the journey. And so it's a product that's more collaboratively built rather than something where you've taken a guess of how you think folks will want it and being pleasantly surprised or in a very different situation if you aren't involving folks throughout the cycle. And so wanted to give that little bit of context. But the last thing I'll touch on, just so that we're all on our journey together is different methods. And so the ones that we'll be touching on today are around you have a clickable prototype and your user is driving that, whether it's on their computer in person or maybe it's remote research and they're sharing their screen. We also have clickable facilitator driven, meaning that you, the researcher or facilitator for the call, are sharing your screen, or you're the one who's kind of got the laptop and you're taking direction. And then the last one, Wizard of Oz, which is as it sounds, person behind the curtain, and you're actually acting as the interface. And so if this was voice UI, for example, you have someone speak a prompt to you, and based on what they've given, you look to your design and you spit out a response back. And so you're acting as the product. And so we'll talk more about that. On the screen, though, I have an image of a video editor. It has our video player, some buttons around how to clip it. We'll be using this to frame one of our discussions later, but I just wanted to pull it out as an example of a high fidelity prototype image that you might use for one of these methods. Maybe it's clickable and you have interactive pieces to it. So that's our framing, our foundation for our talk today, so that we can actually dive into specifics around different assistive technologies and how to set yourself up for success with running research with folks. So we'll go through 3 buckets, but I'll start with screen magnification users. So this is anyone who's increasing the magnification on their screen. And so you might have done that in your browser, gone up to 200%. This could also be 400%, but it's more than just magnification. It's also a suite of tools. And so someone might invert their color. They might increase the size of their cursor so it's easy to track. If they're on mobile, maybe they use font scaling. There's all these items that are part of the suite of tools that are available to magnification users and need to be considered when you get into an interview with someone, because if you don't know what their typical preferences are, it makes it hard to frame their feedback. And so making sure that you make space at the start of the call, basically, and make space to just discuss, hey, talk me through your settings. How do you normally navigate? If they're on mobile app, and have them go into settings and show me what their font scaling's up to, because it's really important for framing the conversation and kind of knowing what they look for in an experience. When you're getting into kind of deciding your methodology, this is a group that I typically recommend you want them driving the prototype, just because if we're in remote research and I'm driving the prototype, I'm sharing my screen over a video and my person on the other end is magnifying a video. And so the pixelation of that experience is going to be different than what it would be if they just have that prototype in front of them and are able to interact with it. You want to go for something that's least likely to pixelate when it comes to this group, because it will impact the type of feedback you get. The other side to consider is you have a really cool opportunity to go through specific designs that might impact this group. So having a chat about dark mode, or being able to present your dark mode designs that you're considering, or even, okay, we've made a specific design that covers font scaling, and I don't know if I need to truncate here or if we should keep the font size the same. Those are discussions you can have with folks and actually get the user's perspective in terms of what they'd prefer to have happen before you get it to your engineering team. So lots of opportunities kind of from the get-go there. I'll move us on to our second category, which is alternative navigation users. And so this is anything augmenting a traditional mouse or keyboard experience. And so this is someone who might navigate with just their voice, or maybe with their eyes. depending on what type of assistive technology they prefer to use. And so for this group, I find often folks haven't experienced alternative navigation before. And so taking that time at your start of the call to have them demo their specific assistive technology of using their voice to navigate or showing you how they select things with their eyes, just so that you have better understanding when you actually get into your interview. Specifically with speech to text, I want to flag out that I usually recommend folks drive. So this would be one where I'd have the clickable prototype and I'd be navigating it based on what my participant tells me. So if they tell me click the submit button, I'm going to act like their assistive technology and do those clicks for them. And that's because for speech to text technology specifically, it needs a label on the button, or folks have to use a very cumbersome navigation method. And so you can get negative feedback. And it actually has to do with the prototyping software. It has nothing to do with your design. And so I find if I'm driving, I'm able to better discuss labeling, preferred behavior, things like that with my speech to text users. That said, there's folks in the alternative navigation category, for example, with eye gaze, where having them drive is actually preferred because then you can talk about touch targets and that sizing and figure out, do you have enough space or how is it to scroll through? And so I usually set myself up in a way where I can choose in the moment which method of them driving or me driving will get me the best results. You also get to kind of hear common pain points that folks have and be considerate for design patterns that are known to cause challenges for this specific assistive technology group. I'll move us right along to our last group. So this is screen reader users. So this is visually, I have text on the screen, there's an image. If I was using a screen reader, it would say things like screen reader users heading, and then we go to considerations and opportunities, and then we go through our bullet list, and the markup would be read out. I'm accessing all of this visual information through speech, essentially. So it's text to speech software. It's the reverse of what we were just chatting about. But for this group, folks are often, it's a daunting experience of how do I approach working with screen reader users, because your standard prototyping software that relies on kind of image-based rendering of your designs is totally inaccessible. There are some new things in the industry. Figma is working very hard in terms of creating an accessible prototyping experience, but there's some other ways you can tackle it by, you know what, I really want to learn about the information architecture that we've designed. I'll put everything in a Word doc and I'll use heading markup to get feedback on my headings, the structure there, the content that I'm planning to have. There's ways to kind of approach screen reader users earlier in the phase. You could even do it where you're just having a conversation of, you know what, we're thinking of doing a modal, and in this modal you're selecting other users and talking through that behavior, just so that you can kind of conceptualize how you're thinking of implementing and get some feedback based on people's past experiences interacting with similar experiences. But I want to just call out the most important piece for this group is choosing a method that you feel comfortable and confident with. You do not need to be an expert with screen reader users to get value out of this phase, but you need to set yourself up for success with having a plan B, C, D. If you get into the interview and you're like, oh, what I'm trying out isn't working, you know what, let's just pivot and have a conversation, and being okay with kind of adjusting if that's what you find you need. The other thing I want to flag is because things aren't fully built and folks aren't going through it with their specific keystrokes or screen reader settings and things like that, there is always a consideration for doing it again once there's a functional prototype or before launch, just so that you do have folks go through the developed experience as well to catch those things that you might not be able to get feedback on in the prototyping phase, depending on which method you chose. There's always going to need to be follow-up so that you have that more holistic picture of how the experience interacted. The other side is this is especially the group that you're likely to get a lot of engineering insight into, and just making sure that you're set up to hand that off to the right folks in the room. So as a bit of a primer, I want to go a bit deeper and talk more about one specific methodology that you can use for your screen reader users. And so for Wizard of Oz, I mentioned, you're acting as the actual product. In this case, when we talk about Wizard of Oz testing, you're not only the product, but you're also someone's assistive technology. And so on the screen, for example, I have that video editor. If I was pretending to be someone's screen reader, I might read out video editor heading level 2, and then kind of ask them, where do you want to go from here? They might tell me, oh, you know what? I want to cycle through all the buttons. And I'd go kind of pause button, sound adjustment button, one-time speed button. You start to have a format of how you want to read things out. You can work with your engineering team to kind of decide like, oh, you know what? This pause button, we're actually going to code it up as a toggle button. And being able to have those conversations with developers or even accessibility specialists. If you aren't sure how things are intended to read, it's good to make sure you have more than one folks. That said, don't feel not empowered to tackle this on your own. You can always have it be a conversation in the sense of maybe you don't know how screen readers read certain things, but you know what all these elements are. And so you can say like, hey, you know, so we're in a section, starts with a heading. That heading is video editor. Talk me through how you'd expect that to read out. And you can still have an approach where you're going through the prototype piece by piece, or let's say you're really interested in one specific feature where we get to the bottom, there is a start clip and an end clip. And in those two areas, you have basically a stepper where you can go up and down. Talk me through, do you have any time where you've really enjoyed this type of behavior? You're able to kind of pull on folks' past experiences and understand how do they expect these things to behave based on how you're describing their functionality and what they're able to accomplish. But I'd say, my voice is dying even though this is pre-recorded. The irony. What I will say is, again, you want to set yourself up to be comfortable in these types of sessions and go in with a clear goal. Because if you're just curious about the start clip, end clip elements on this page, don't put yourself through getting feedback on everything before that. Feel free to kind of gloss it over of like, there's a video player, you're able to adjust things on it, but we're going to drill in on this section around clipping and actually just jump folks to the parts that are pertinent to your research. It's good to go narrower and really focus in on what you're interested in when you're doing this type of methodology. Bring a friend. It is helpful for researchers if you have someone else acting as the screen reader in these types of calls rather than the person facilitating. But that said, if you don't have time or space, it's It's okay to run it on your own. But I'd say just be flexible. If something's not working, be open to pivoting and just having that conversation and finding a way to have a discussion and still get value from the session, even if you aren't able to perfectly mimic a screen reader. There's no need to think that you have to. Instead, you're just looking to get more information than you had before. And just engaging screen reader users at this stage can be quite rare. And so you're already setting yourself up to have a more inclusive product, even if you're kind of learning, how do I want to run this methodology and be set up for success? So I'll end us off on kind of just reiterating that value that you get from shifting left and kind of co-designing with your users to kind of reduce number of accessibility bugs or challenges that you are unintentionally introducing into your product. And then we went through those specific considerations for magnification, alternative navigation, and then we dug real deep on our screen reader prototype reviews and just how to set yourself up for success. But keep in mind, accessibility is a journey. You're constantly building your accessibility muscle. And so anything that you do today that you didn't do yesterday is already a step in the right direction. You're already practicing those skills and leveling up in terms of how you think about and approach accessibility in your product cycle. So on that, pass it back to myself to bring in the Q&A period.